So I apologize. I realize this is not the best view of this piece, but unfortunately in a shop like this, on bigger pieces, and this isn't necessarily large, it's just kind of tall, there's usually one spot I could put it in. So kind of shifted it this way so you get a better view. Originally it was facing towards the other side of the shop. But this is basically my next project. This is about 95% done, just about ready for finish. It's very similar to a piece I made a couple months ago, which was a mid-century modern style modular wall unit. This is also a standalone piece that the design is mid-century modern, but this one has a little bit of storage, some wine storage, and some shelving. Now this customer is different than the customer I was just talking about, and they have a little alcove in their house. They actually have a piece of furniture in it that looks kind of similar to this, but this one, the height, the width, and the depth, as well as the design of where they wanted the storage and the wine, is custom to the space. So this is, a lot of time, these are the sorts of jobs I get. I'm living in a town that's a little bit older. A lot of the houses here were built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The architecture isn't standard, so a lot of my jobs are basically people went to go find a piece of furniture and you just can't find stuff that fits into the particular space they have. This piece is a perfect example of that. So this, I believe, is only going to be a two-part series. The first part I've already started editing. I'm going to show you how to make the basic frame, as well as I believe I start showing you how I make the square boxes. The construction of this is going to be very similar to the piece I was talking about before. So if you don't like, this isn't what I would consider a duplicate project. I try not to film duplicates on the channel. The style is definitely different, but the construction of it is pretty similar. So just a heads up about that. So when I did that other project back in the fall, I picked up some extra walnut. I'm always happy I do that because lumber does not go to waste in this shop. So this is actually from the same stack of lumber. I'm going to start by ripping it down. The piece I made before, I went with much thinner strips. The thickness of this is the same. The width is going to be a little thicker on this piece, just because I knew it was going to be holding a pretty heavy storage cabinet, as well as potentially, I haven't calculated how many wine bottles will fit in this, but wine bottles get heavy pretty quickly. So I knew this was going to be holding up more weight than the other one, and I wanted the sides to be a little bit thicker. So I went down and ripped these down. The lumber itself was about a little over 1.5 inches thick, so that's what I ended up with, and then about 1 inch wide. So I'm going to go through and put mortises in these. This is pretty standard for the shop. I like to build with mortise and tenon, and I have a mortising machine, so it's really easy work. The first shelf is starting about 4 inches off the ground, so all I did was start from the bottom, mark up 4 inches, and the stretchers I'm putting on this, or the side rails, are going to be the same thickness as what I'm working with here. So that was pretty simple to lay out these mortises, and I could go through and chisel those out. If you set up your mortising machine properly, you could see I could do the bottom one and then flip it and do the top. Now this whole piece is going to be on an angle, and they didn't want it more than 29 inches deep. So I'm going to be using my table saw in order to get some straight points where I can mark that angle. So you can see I set it up at 29 inches, and I could use a square to mark the underside of this piece, and that is the angle I'm going to need. Now you could set up a jig to cut this, but I'm not a great hand sawer, but I could do it well enough to cut something this small by hand. It's quicker than setting up a jig, and then I'll have my angle. So that's what it looks like setting at the edge of my table saw, and then you could see how the top, it tapers towards the top. So now the front, all of your mortises are going to be at an angle. So I'm using the angle from the bottom to transfer it up to the top, the same distance, 4 inches up, and then I can mark where the mortise is going to be at the top. So same thing, I have this set up. I could walk up to the top. I have my marks on the straight piece, and then I could use the bevel gauge, which I finally get it oriented in the right direction, and transfer the height of that to this piece. Angled stuff looks great. I love the way this piece looks, but it is a lot more work. Same thing with anything with a curve is going to be more work than straight edges and 90 degrees. So for the mortise, you can see I was able to chisel out a lot of it, but you're going to have to hand chisel out the angled pieces. So I removed the bulk on the mortising machine just to save some time, and then the rest of it I had to hand chisel out so that that angled tenon would fit in. You could probably get away with not making the tenon angled, making it straight. You will lose a fair amount of material if you do that. So I just decided to suck it up and chisel out those pieces. It's not terribly hard work. It's with only 2 sides. I only had to do it 4 times. So then once I had that set up, I can mark where I'm going to be cutting the tenons based on the depth of the mortise. I could raise the blade. I always do scrap pieces with this first, which I don't film. So I did a test piece to make sure I could get the tenon right. I have a stop, so they're going to be the exact same depth, and that is the test piece. To do the angled one, I had to set up kind of an intricate jig here. I have a stop so that it doesn't move on me, and I'm using the exact same angle I used to get the bottom piece to set up an angle on the saw there, and you could see I could then cut that angled tenon. Once again, it's not necessarily difficult work, but it's much more time consuming to build in curves and angles. It's just a series of curve cuts. I could clean it up, and then there's my piece. So I did the bottom one first to make sure everything would fit. Did not do the bottom and the top at the same time because I think it would have been very hard to make all those measurements and have everything fit perfectly. So with the bottom in place, I could then move my way to the top and do the exact same thing now that everything's set in place. So I could rough out the width of this, I can mark my pieces, and then for this one I didn't feel like resetting up the radial arm saw because you had to flip it in order to do both sides, and I decided just to use my miter gauge set at the proper angle, which I used from the bottom pieces in order to set that up, and just do curve cuts on the table saw. A lot of times in woodworking there's 6 ways to do one particular job. Sometimes I try to stick to efficiency because this is a business, so doing things slowly is not super smart. But sometimes I do prefer just to do things by hand or a different way, just to use a different tool I haven't used in a while. So as you can see, you can cut these on the radial arm saw, you can cut these on the table saw, you can cut these with a router. It's really kind of how you decide to get the job done. And then there's that piece. That looks like a gap, but there's actually a little bit of a chunk of the top piece of that board missing. And there's my top. I left the top long. I will cut these down once everything's glued up. So then the boxes that are going, the bottom box is going to be a drawer, and the customer did not want the face of that bottom box to go past the edge. So I marked the rough height of it, and then I came down with an angle in order to mark where my first stretcher on the bottom is going to go, just so that everything lines up. A lot of times when building, these are the things that are sometimes overlooked. So whenever I'm sending an estimate, I try to think all these things out beforehand. And I gave them the option of having the boxes either stick out past the front of the face or be in line with it, in order to not have to ask a ton of questions while I'm building. Inevitably, stuff will pop up, but that was something I did think of beforehand. So then for the stretchers, I'm putting dado grooves in these. These are going to be dovetails, but it's easier to rough out the bulk of the material with a dado stack. So I could do the 2 edges with a stop so they're equidistant from each other, and then I can move it and do my 2 centers also with a stop so those are equidistant from each other. This is important with something like this. If these aren't square, it won't line up, and then adding all the shelving will just be a nightmare as your mistake is compounded as you work down the line. So this is what that looks like with the dovetail. I'm using a bushing and a jig that I actually made for a table I just finished. It's been versatile for many things, so the bushing will ride along that jig, and the bulk of the material is already cut out. So this is the bottom side of the piece. Since it's the bottom, you'll never see it, and I could just pre-drill a little bit, sink a screw in there. I'm lining up the dado cut with the opening in my piece, and then I could just ride that dovetail bit up that jig and get a perfect cut each time. So like I said, I already had this made. You can make this many different ways. This wasn't really ideal for this. You could see I kind of have it mounted funny, but I don't like to make things I don't need, and I was able to make this work. And then you could see with the way I cut it, they're absolutely perfect. They line up perfectly with each other, so building this will be pretty easy. And that's what those look like on the bottom. Once again, I'm building these so this piece can't pull apart. Those dovetails will make it so these boards will never be able to pull apart. Dados aren't as structural as dovetails. They are more time consuming, but also because, like I said, there's going to be two fairly heavy boxes on the bottom of this, and I wanted something pretty strong to hold up that weight. So to cut the dovetails, that bit is a 14 degree bit, so this is tilted at a 14 degree. Once again, I always do a test piece, and once I get it fitted perfectly, I could go through and cut all those dovetails. Now these are actually a little bit wider than the pieces on the side, and you'll see why, because there's going to be a decorative element on the bottom. I'm roughly working off some photos the customer sent me online. It's not identical to any of them, but that's where some of the design elements are coming in. So when you curve cut the shoulders off of these dovetails, you usually have a little bit that goes into the material to do it on the radial arm saw. It's the fastest way to do it, but keep in mind you will have that. You won't really see these, which is why I decided to do it that way. So then I mark center. I'm just adding a slight curve to either end of these. It's a little bit of a decorative element. I'm just using a piece of tape to make that curve. I don't have a bandsaw. My jigsaw does not cut super great at the moment, so I'm going to start all these cuts on the table saw, and then I'm going to finish them up by hand, just so that I have a straight reference to work off of. You can't go all the way through, or the back side will have a longer curve cut than the front. So I have a piece of tape on there, and you can see I'm just sending all of my pieces through. So then I could go through and just finish that cut, and then use a coping saw to make the curve, and then finish it up with a sander. So now the edge of this piece will be the same thickness as what's already down there, and then the rise is what the top will sit on. And then these dovetails just slide into place. Now the width of all this is based on the opening in the customer's house, so that's how I decided all of that. I think the inside between the legs is about 26 inches at this point. And that's what all of those look like. So then I glued these together. I didn't film that. I think my camera died at that point, but I like to stack these and glue them together. If they're a little off, it's easier to work with if both of them are a little off. So if you stack them and glue them together, as long as they line up with each other, it's usually easier to do. I could trim down the top. This one's also getting a round over, just like the piece I made in the fall, but it's not as severe. It's very slight, so you just round it over all the outside edges of the piece, not the inside edges. So then for the boxes, they're going to be made out of plywood. I'm cutting this down in my shop. I absolutely hate using this hardwood veneer ply. It looks beautiful once the piece is done, but the veneer on this ply is so thin, it's just a pain to work with. It chips very easily. Sanding it, you could very easily sand through the veneer. It's not my favorite material to work with. Like I said, once you're done with it, it looks beautiful, but then I'm putting some 45s on the edges. I usually use a lock miter bit to do this, but to be perfectly honest, the lock miter works great. I love how structural it is, but it is a pain to set up, and that is saying that with having purchased the setup block for it, just because all this plywood is going to be a different thicknesses. Some's 3/4, some's 23/32, some's 11/32. It really is a pain. Nothing's equal. So since this is going to be flanked on two sides and screwed into those bottom portions, I didn't think it needed the lock miter. It could get away with just regular miters. So I just cut all the miters on my pieces. These are the sides I'm cutting now. I have all the miters, and then I could cut everything down to size. There's two boxes. One's obviously deeper than the other, but the sides and everything and the width was all the same. So I could cut most of my pieces at once, could dry fit these together with some clamps, and then just test this in place. I believe this is where this video is going to end off. The next video will be showing you how I finish up the boxes, adding the shelves, the drawers, and the wine storage, and finishing it. But essentially, I've been looking into some of these hard wax finishes that a lot of people are using. I know Odie's Oil is one of them, Rubio Monocoat's another one. And basically, I just wanted to ask at the end of this video, do people leave comments about if they have used them and if they have like them. My finish of choice right now is usually Waterlox for more durable finish, and then general finishes, but it takes multiple coats to apply them. So now that I've been hearing more about some of these finishes that are easy to apply in 1 or 2 coats, I'm not going to lie, my interest is piqued. Before purchasing them, I know a lot of really talented people also watch this channel and wanted to get some feedback on that.